Hello, and welcome to the City of Menlo Park proposed budget overview for fiscal year 21-22. This presentation was developed by me, Jen Wolosin, Menlo Park City Council member. I first want to point out that the observations and opinions in this presentation are mine alone and do not represent the viewpoints of the Menlo Park City Council. And I also want to note that this presentation was created on May 28th, 2021, and some of the numbers may get updated. So as I mentioned, I'm Jen Wolosin, Menlo Park City Council person for District 3. I was elected in November 2020. One of my core values is to make government as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, which is why I've put together this Cliff Notes version of the Menlo Park City budget. It's to help residents and stakeholders understand how to navigate and review this complicated information. I've done my best to double check numbers and to make sure that all the information I'm providing is truthful and accurate. There may be some inadvertent errors, and if you do find them, please let me know. I would love to fix those. I also want to encourage you, if you like this kind of information, to sign up for my mailing list. You can do so at my website, jenwolosin.com. Just scroll down on any page and click join Jen's mailing list. So in this short presentation, I'm going to give a little bit of information about what a budget is, how to access the Menlo Park 2021 budget, the difference between all funds and the general fund revenues and expenses at a very high level, talking about overviewing what we just covered about the general fund, some service level enhancements that staff is providing to council to consider adding into the budget. And finally, I'll be bringing up some major policy and budget questions that the community and city council will be thinking over in the next month when we have our upcoming budget meetings. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page, I wanted to go over some short pieces of information about what a budget is. So fundamentally, budgets are an expression of values. If you want to see what a community cares about, you've got to follow the money. It's also an estimate of the revenues and expenses for a period of time. So revenue is money coming in, and expenses or expenditures is money going out. And to manage your costs, you either need to raise your revenue or lower your expenses. And at the end, if you have more revenue than expenses, you have what's called a surplus. And if you have more expenses than revenue, you have a deficit. One other important thing to note is that the Menlo Park budget runs on a non-calendar cycle, meaning July 1st is the beginning of our new fiscal year, and our fiscal year ends on June 30th. So how do you even find the Menlo Park budget? Well, some exciting things have happened in the last year or two. We've gone online with our budget, which makes the tool much more powerful and interactive, so you can drill down into different parts of the budget. But it can be a little tricky to find and navigate. The easiest way to find the budget, in my opinion, is to go to the homepage of Menlo Park and find this Open Government tab. Then once you click on it, you'll get to this Open Government page. And way down here, you see Budget and Transparency OpenGov. Click on that. When you clicked on that, you'll get to this kind of OpenGov budget page. And there's two areas. There's reports and stories. And I recommend you click on stories because this is where you'll find kind of the old-fashioned printed out budget in an online form. So there's a cover page, a transmittal letter, some city overview information, and then it gets into different chapters and details about the components of the budget. If you're intimidated or are nervous about clicking around the budget, there is a print-friendly budget available at this link. So let's talk about, for a minute, all funds versus general funds. And I've typed out a lot of information here, but it's important that we go through it. All funds, the city collects and spends a lot of money each year that goes in and out of dozens of funds, but many of these funds are earmarked for specific uses, and those monies must stay in their designated areas. So examples of these types of funds are the below market rate fund, the sidewalk assessment fund, water operations fund, to name a few. So these funds tend to build up balances over time and then draw down on those funds when the money is needed. And that is why sometimes the all funds category runs a surplus, meaning there's more money in there than we are spending, and sometimes it runs a deficit. But for the most part, with the exception of the general fund, almost all of the all funds are not discretionary, which means that the city council typically does not weigh in on them. And below you can see here all of the money that the city is taking in and putting out in this upcoming proposed budget. And you can see for this upcoming year, it's running a deficit, but that's just because there's more projects that were anticipated that money was built up over time to spend on. But we're going to spend most of our time talking about the general fund. The general fund is the city's most active and largest fund, and it represents, well, one of the most large funds, and it represents the most discretionary available revenues and expenditures. So this is where the city council and the community really weigh in on. We use the general fund money for a wide variety of uses, recreation classes, public safety, and the money comes from a variety of sources, mostly property tax, and we're going to go into where that money comes from. Basically, the general fund represents many of the city's priorities, and the general fund is part of that all fund balance, and this is really the focus of what we're going to be talking about. And you can see here that there's about $57 million, almost $58 million of both money coming in and money going out of the general fund for this proposed budget, which leaves us basically even with $9,000 anticipated to be left over. So my pro tip here is if you are clicking around the budget and really looking at it, make sure you're looking at the general fund. And unless you are intentionally looking at all funds, but it can be tricky. So going back to the general fund, if you see here at the bottom of the slide, there's the 57,640,something thousand. That was the revenue we saw on the earlier page here for revenues. So where does that revenue come from? The biggest bucket of revenue that the city collects comes from taxes. So that's 78% of the money that comes into this general fund comes from taxes. And then here I've further broken out, well, what types of taxes does that money represent? So property taxes is the largest category of taxes that the city brings in. That's 63% for this coming year. So the general fund is very dependent on taxes. The next category is charges for services and permits and licensing. And that can be anything from fees we collect from different classes we hold, or developer fees or permits that are coming in. So if we look into how our taxes and charges for services are looking over time, this is a snapshot of historical information from pre-pandemic, 1819. 1920, most of that year was pre-pandemic, but at the end of our fiscal year 2020, when the pandemic hit in March, from March to the end of June we were still in that fiscal year, so there was a hit. Amended budget represents when the council for the last year put together the budget. They were working off a lot of uncertainty, so they did their best to set a budget and they amended it over time. So that's what this column represents. And estimated actuals is taking what this past year has actually looked like in money that is brought in, and estimating kind of what the end of the year money is going to look like. And then this final column is our proposed current year that we're looking at the budget. So over time, if you look at how we were doing with our taxes pre-pandemic, of our revenue, 64% of our revenue source was taxes in 1819. That is now up to 78% proposed in this coming budget. So taxes are definitely a bigger share of the revenue coming into the city. And on the flip side, charges for services were higher because we were offering a lot more services in the city pre-pandemic. And so that was at 18% of total revenue. And for this coming year, it's proposed to be 7%. So as I mentioned, property tax has the biggest chunk of our tax revenue at 63%. We saw this number before. And again, this final column is the proposed year. And if you look at kind of pre-pandemic levels, that's getting pretty close to where we were prior to the pandemic in terms of the proportion of the tax revenue that is coming into the city of taxes. The column that, the row that might be most interesting to some of you is this transit-oriented tax or hotel tax. So that was a huge chunk of our taxes pre-pandemic. We had opened a bunch of new hotels, and with all of the Stanford activity and Facebook business visitors, a lot of hotels were thriving and we were getting a lot of taxes from hotels. You can see over the pandemic that dropped 15%, then 11, 10, and it's going to be rebounding somewhat to 18%. So I just wanted to point that out. And you can definitely learn more about all these pieces of information by reviewing the detailed budget. So we've just looked at revenue. We saw that revenue mostly comes from taxes. But what about our general fund expenses? What are we spending our money on? And you can see here that about 63% of our expenses in the general fund, and remember this number 5763 is 57 million. So going back to the revenues and expenses in the general fund, 63% of our expenses are related to employee costs because we're a very service driven organization. So that's an important thing to note. Another item to note here is that transfers, most of the transfer money, 3.02 million of that is transferred into the Capital Improvement Project Fund. And the CIP is a fund that we use to keep our infrastructure up to date. And not only do we use funds that are put in almost every year from the general fund into this Capital Improvement Fund, but we also have to find other sources of revenue like grants and other things to pay for some of these large capital projects. So I could go on and on about capital improvement projects. It's probably another video, but the budget document on the city's website does have quite a bit of information about capital improvement projects and how that funding is going to be used. So I encourage those of you interested in that information to go back to the budget and check that out. So going back to expenses, and I broke down here expenses by department because I know a lot of people are curious about this. So if we're looking just at that salary and benefit expenses, which we saw is most of a great part of our city's general fund expenses at 36 million. This is how that money is broken out by department. So the police department gets a lot of our salary and benefit money, followed by a library and community services and public works. And over here on the right, you can see how many employees we have in each department and what the percent of all employees in the city that represents. So our number of employees are pretty well distributed between police, library, public works. They all have a similar number of employees, but you can see that the salary and benefits are quite different in those departments. Also here I have how the number of city employees has changed over time. So 2020 was kind of our pre-pandemic staffing level. And there were a lot of hard decisions that were made because of the pandemic. And we had to unfortunately lay off quite a few staff members. So for this current budget, we are assuming that we're not really adding back a whole lot of employees. And we're going to get into the service level enhancements and how we could add back employees to get back where we were almost before the pandemic. A few things to note under general administration, that does include the city council, which there are 5 members, and non-departmental. You might be wondering, how can there be a negative number for salary and benefits? So the city assumes a vacancy rate of this coming year, we're assuming a 7% vacancy rate, that not every position will be filled. So I apologize that this is a blurry graph, but this chart, this graph shows the revenues and expenses over time for the general fund. So this final column, we've seen these numbers before, about 57, 58 million anticipated revenues and expenses for this proposed budget. If you go back and look at how we were doing pre-pandemic, you will see that our revenues were quite higher, about $13 million higher, and we had higher expenses because we were running more services associated with that. So this graph is showing how our revenues and expenses have kind of taken a hit during the pandemic. I do want to note that included in this lower revenue number is some accounting changes that are happening to the general fund. We do have about $3.9 million that was once attributed to the general fund that is moving into different fund categories. So I just wanted to point out that some of this dip here, this would be higher if it were not for some accounting changes. So to highlight some of the changes that I mentioned in this presentation, the proposed budget is assuming that revenues and expenses are going to remain pretty similar to last year. The transit occupancy tax, the hotel tax, will be rebounding somewhat, but not completely, because we know taxes is an important revenue source for the city. The proposed budget is keeping most of the service and staffing cuts that were implemented during the pandemic budget process. So again, it's going to be relatively similar in this baseline proposed budget. And this baseline proposed budget does not assume the use of any one-time money. And this final point here is what I mentioned on the previous slide about some accounting changes that has moved some of the general fund revenue sources into other funds. So I've mentioned that we, in the proposed budget, are not planning on adding back services, but we could. And this is going to be one of the key conversation points that the community and the city council will be discussing during this budget process. The staff has prepared an a la carte menu of potential service level enhancements or positions and services that could be added back to the city if we want to kind of rebound fast and fully from COVID's layoffs. So what the staff has done is created different tiers on the left-hand column, kind of their highest recommendations, what departments these enhancements would come from, what the estimated amount would be, and that's inclusive of salary and benefits and pension costs, how many full-time employees it would take. So this top area is an employee headcount. This bottom area is more program related. And then I've gone and summarized what those items are. And in the transmittal letter in the budget document, there's a larger description of each of these. So if the a la carte menu, if someone said, we want to take it all, it would cost close to $4 million to add back just these. So more than 4 million if we're adding all this stuff back. And it would add approximately 30 employees to the headcount, which would bring our headcount numbers to almost 280, which is still a little bit lower than what we were pre-pandemic. So the bridge to recovery. So this illustration kind of shows our current situation. So the pandemic caused a lot of service and staffing budget cuts, most or which are still in place in that proposed baseline budget. Over here, we have kind of the post-recovery picture, which is economic recovery with our revenue stream and associated expenses back and running. Service and staffing levels are restored to pre-pandemic levels. So the big kind of budget question this year is, how are we going to get over this bridge? How quickly are we going to go? And is our destination the same as it was before the pandemic, which is an interesting question. So here I've outlined kind of those questions in another way. And these are the questions that I encourage you to think about when you are processing the budget. Given the budget projections and what is known and unknown about COVID and economic recovery, what services and staffing should be added back to the city, and when should those additions be made? How should we pay for it? Should we use one-time money? I'm sure many of you heard about the federal money, the American Rescue Plan Act or ARPA funds, Or should we wait until traditional funding sources like taxes and charges for services completely recover, kind of make sure we can pay for it ourselves without using any outside money? And then because that influx of government, federal government money, ARPA money, which by the way is about a total of 6.5 million given over 2 years, so about 3.25 million for 2 fiscal cycles. So if we don't want to use that ARPA money to get over that bridge, what else would we want to use that money for? So that's about my overview. This is just to whet your appetite about how to look at and think about the budget. There are 3 major opportunities coming up for the public to learn even more and to weigh in about the budget. June 1st, this coming Tuesday, depending on when you're watching this video, at 5 p.m. there's a budget workshop, and this is really a community opportunity to come and ask questions about the budget. There will be no council discussion or decisions being made on June 1st. June 8th is a public hearing. So this is really when the public can come and kind of answer some of those policy and budget questions that I've raised at the end of this presentation. And council will be giving direction to staff on those at this time. And then on June 22nd is when the council will be planning to adopt the budget. So I encourage you to stay informed, pay attention. The agendas for all of these meetings will be on the city's website at the link below. And if you have any questions or comments about this presentation or about the budget in general, feel free to contact me anytime at jwolosin@menlopark.org. I also have a newsletter to keep residents and stakeholders informed. And you can join my newsletter by visiting my website at jenwolosin.com, scrolling down to the bottom and clicking Join Jen's mailing list. So I hope this helped you gain a better understanding about the budget, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks and have a great day.